We are recording.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this AIM Center webinar. The topic for today is Reading for All, Part 1, Getting to Know EPUB. Just to make sure that you have everything you need to get the best experience out of this webinar, I want to let you know that we do have closed captions available, and we want to thank Beth, who's going to be providing those captions. Just make sure to select the closed caption button in your Zoom menu bar, and those captions will appear along the bottom of your screen. So really appreciate Beth and ACS for providing the captioning this afternoon. And then we want to make this as interactive as possible. Part of these webinars is not only the information that we provide, but also building our community of people that are dedicated to accessibility. So we want to make sure you have an opportunity to connect with each other, and the text chat is a great vehicle to do that. Make sure when you're using the chat that you choose all panelists and attendees. There's a drop-down menu. As you see the messages scroll by, underneath the messages, there's a drop-down menu. Make sure you choose all panelists and attendees to make sure that everyone in the chat can see your messages and questions. I want to remind you that materials for this webinar will be available for download on the AIM Center website. There's a short URL that Leslie has posted in the chat that will allow you to go to a page on our AIM Center website, and there you'll be able to access the recording for this session. So this session is being recorded so that you can review it at a later time. Or if you're attending now, you can go back and review what you've learned in the recording. So that recording will be available about a week from now once it has been closed captioned. You'll also be able to access a digital handout from the same page where the recording is located. And that digital handout will have links to a lot of the resources that we're going to mention during the webinar this afternoon, along with a copy of the slides as well. So feel free to use those resources to support your learning from this webinar. All right, so I'm Luis Perez. I'm a technical assistant specialist with CAST, and I'm primarily assigned to the National AIM Center. And with me this afternoon is Christine Jones. So Christine, do you want to do a quick introduction?
Hey everyone, it's great to be with you all. And as Luis mentioned, I'm Christine Jones. I'm the Associate Director of Global Literacy at Benetech. And in that capacity, I mostly oversee outreach and support around Bookshare. Many of you are probably familiar with Bookshare, but Benetech actually has a lot of investment in the area of making materials accessible beyond Bookshare. And so it is in that capacity really today that I'm representing Benetech and representing the work that we're doing to help publishers and content creators know what they need to know and understand what they need to understand to make materials work for as many readers as possible. And I'm excited to be with you all today.
We're excited to have you, Christine. And our contact information is available on the slides. We'll also share it. Actually, Leslie has already beat me to it. She shared that in the chat. So we're both available if you have any questions about the content from this webinar. We're happy to help you out. All right, so that's a little bit about us, but we want to know about you as well and what you bring to this presentation and what your background knowledge is. So Leslie is going to release a poll real quick, and we love to get your feedback or your input with that poll. So we want to know a little bit about your previous experience with EPUB. And so you have some options here. I have not heard of it before is one of the options. I have heard the term, but I don't know what it is or how it differs from other formats. I have read documents or ebooks in EPUB, or I can customize the features, including the font size, the colors, the reading speed when reading an EPUB. And then lastly, I have created EPUBs or converted other formats. So we'll give you a few seconds there to respond, and then I will read out the results. All right, it looks like we have, I'll give you another 30 seconds or so. All right, Leslie, if you could go ahead and end the poll. Let's take a look here. So it looks like the highest category is 40% of you have read documents or books in EPUB. And then next to that, we have, I've heard the term, but I don't know what it is or how it differs from other formats. That's 34%. And then third, it looks like we have, I have not heard of it before now with 23%. And then smaller amounts of the other options here. Thank you so much. So that's really helpful for us to know where you're coming from. All right, so today, the topics that we're going to address. We're going to provide a quick introduction to EPUB. It sounds like some of you have some background knowledge already. So we're going to be able to zip right through that. We're going to talk about some sources of high quality EPUBs so that you can find titles that you can start exploring the features of EPUB with. And that leads into a demo or a quick exploration of some of the features of EPUB, the benefits of EPUB for learners and content creators. And then I want to remind you all that this is part of a 3-part webinar series. So today is really some background information. It's setting the foundation for the rest of the series. In part 2, we're going to really look at interacting with EPUB titles. What are some of the features that we want to look for and how do they work? And then in part 3, we're going to look at, well, now that you've experienced EPUB and the features that are available, how do you get started with creating your own EPUB titles? So just remember that this is part of a 3-part series. So let's begin with just a quick overview of the basics. And this is to make sure that we're all on the same page. And we're going to look at what is EPUB and where can I find high quality EPUB titles. So EPUB is short for electronic publication. That's where the EPUB name comes from. And it's a standard for authoring and distributing digital publications and documents. It's a format that is more widely usable than PDF. So it works really well on mobile devices where you have small screens. And EPUB works really well for that. So it's a format that we can access on a variety of different devices. And it's also quickly becoming a preferred format in post-secondary and trade publishing. And we'll cover some of that later on when we look at the different places where you can download EPUB titles. So a lot of the publishing world has moved to using EPUB as one of their primary formats. And then a lot of post-secondary textbooks are available in EPUB. So as K-12 educators, if we can start using EPUB as our format of preferred format, then we're really doing a lot to prepare students for how they access that content once they move on to post-secondary or a lifetime of learning beyond just school into the workforce or leisure learning. So as we mentioned, EPUB is really gaining traction in the publishing world. And in fact, there are many times when we are using EPUB in many cases in K-12 without even knowing it. So what I want to do now is just to make sure that we all understand how EPUB works is I'm going to actually exit out of my slides and I'm going to do a quick demonstration on my iPad here and try not to knock over my microphone. So I'm going to exit out of here and then I'm going to bring up a screen sharing application called Reflector, and you'll be able to see my iPad screen. There we go. Okay, so hopefully you're all able to see that. So here what I've done, and we're going to show you where you can access an EPUB title so that you can try this out on your own after the webinar. So that's going to be one of your tasks following this webinar. So I've opened a copy of William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet in EPUB format, and I can navigate this book in a variety of different ways. I can use a flicking gesture so that I'm going from one page to the next. I can also tap once on the screen, and that brings up some controls at the top of the screen. And one of the nice things here is I can access a table of contents. So that's really helpful because it gives you an idea of how the book is organized, but it also provides some really flexible navigation. So I can skip to any part of this book just by selecting one of the entries in this table of contents. Flexible navigation, really important. I can also adjust the appearance of the information. So again, I can tap once on the screen if I don't see the controls. And then towards the upper right-hand corner, there's an icon that has 2 letter A's on it. And if I select that icon, I can then resize the text. And one of the characteristics of EPUB is that it is a reflowable format. So what that means is here I'm on a small screen on a mobile device. And as I resize the text, it's going to reflow to fit into that viewport or that space that's available on the screen. So now the text that was at the bottom of the previous this page, that text is going to be pushed over so it appears on the next page. So I can resize the text. I can come in here, I can add a sepia background, or I can add additional contrast so that, for instance, if I'm reading outside in bright lighting, I now have a much better experience in terms of the contrast. And I can also choose different fonts. So if I want to choose a font that has less ornamentation to it, what we call sans serif fonts, I can choose something like San Francisco, and that gives me a much cleaner font that is much more easier. It's easier to read on the screen. So the application that I'm using here is the Books app. That's available on Apple devices such as the iPad and the iPhone, and it's also available on the Mac. Let's go ahead and I'm just going to reset just at least to the default color here. The other thing I can do is bring up some read out loud features. So on the iPad, I can make a selection. And then I can have that content that I have selected spoken out loud.
Shape no bigger than an agate stone.
Or I can also use a feature called Speak Screen, and then that can read all of the content for me, including the flipping of the pages when it gets to the bottom of the content that's being read out loud. And that's activated with a special gesture where I just swipe down from the top of the screen with 2 fingers. So hopefully this will come through. You'll be able to hear it. Oh.
GHT, or lawyer's fingers, who straight dream on fees, or a lady's lips, who straight on kisses dream, which oft the angry mad with blisters plagues, because their breath with sweet meat tainted are, sometimes she gallops over.
I'll go ahead and pause that. Sorry about that. I had it a little bit too fast there because I typically listen to my books at a pretty high speed. So that is just a quick overview, again, using one of the free apps that's available on one of these platforms on the Mac and on the iPad and iPhone. But just to give you a sense of some of the features of EPUB. And in webinar 2 of this series, we're going to explore those features in even more detail. So let me exit out of the iPad here, go back to our slides. So EPUB is essentially, when we look at it, is essentially a website that has been compressed into a single file. And that makes it an easy format to share over the web, for people to download so that they can open it in their preferred reading app. So I just showed you one of those apps. There are many out there. Later on in this webinar, we're going to go over a partial list of some of the reading systems that you can use to open EPUB. And because essentially an EPUB is a website that's been compressed, it does have the extension .epub, but it's essentially a zip file. And in fact, you can change the extension to .zip and actually open an EPUB and look inside of it, and you'll find a bunch of web pages along with other files that determine how the EPUB is going to be displayed. But because it's based on these robust web technologies, that means that there's a really nice opportunity to leverage what we know about accessibility on the web, so that we can create documents and publications that are have really good support for accessibility, whether that's read out loud, as I just demonstrated briefly, or that's the use of a screen reader for somebody who needs that kind of support. So we've just shown you a few of the features of EPUB. You know, it has reflowable text, so it allows it to adjust to smaller screens. You saw that I can customize the display by adjusting the text size, by choosing different fonts, by changing the background color and the text color. And there are more options. In some, it all depends on the reading system that you're using or the reading app. Sometimes you can customize the line spacing or the margins. And then there's also flexible navigation. So I could flip through the pages of the book, or I could bring up the table of contents and go right to a section of the book where I want to start reading out loud, and support for read out loud. And we're going to cover that in more detail in part 2 of this webinar series. So I'm going to turn it over to Nicole, or sorry, Christine, and she's going to talk to us about why EPUB now, because this is a really critical time for EPUB.
Yes, it is, Luis. Thank you so much. So yeah, great information and background too for everyone. And I just want to say at the outset that we designed this presentation to really speak to not just those of you who work with kids in special education or who work in assistive technology and perhaps are already somewhat familiar with the idea of needing to make materials work for students with different kinds of reading differences and learning differences. Rather, we wanted to gear this toward a wider audience, so we hope that you'll consider sharing this with the recording of this webinar with others in your organization who are either purchasing or creating materials, just so that they can understand the value. And as Luis mentioned, just EPUB is a format that almost guarantees an excellent reading experience on nearly any device, whether it's a mobile device or a Chromebook or a computer. And it ensures a lot of features that are helpful, that just happen to be helpful to students with learning differences, such as the ability to have text read out loud with corresponding word highlighting, the customization options that Luis mentioned. So the format and the tools that read EPUB together really offer that level of customization and all that different functionality that is so helpful. And the fact is that students with and without learning differences will find those helpful. For students with some learning differences, those features are essential, necessary for them to consume the same content as their peers. But those without any learning differences may also find those helpful, those different functions that EPUB and the tools that read it offer. So that's part of why we wanted to promote this. And as Luis said, the format is gaining a lot of traction in post-secondary, and largely that's driven by those who've been pushing for more accessibility of publications for people with reading barriers, people who have visual impairments, people who have reading challenges such as dyslexia and others. They have successfully really lobbied the post-secondary industry and the publishers, and you know, Benetech has had a huge role in that, lobbying those publishers and content creators to produce their materials in a format that is going to ensure an accessible experience, reading experience. And so we wanted to apply some of the same pressure now in the K-12 space that has been so successful in the post-secondary world, and just wanted to start getting the message out about the benefits. Luis, I thought it was really interesting that the poll that 25% of the folks today hadn't even heard of EPUB. And we know that that's true, that's really the reason we're doing this. I was attending, this was probably 2 years ago now at ISTE, the ISTE conference. I was in a workshop on, you know, how to create books, digital books, you know, as part of the learning or curriculum experience. And they were actually creating EPUBs, but they recently had made a change to their tool so that they didn't call it EPUBs, because they said nobody knows what that is. So we're just going to say digital books or whatever. So the truth is that this format has been out there. It's been in use. As Louise said, you're probably reading EPUBs and you don't even know it. But it's time as an industry and as a community that we really wholeheartedly embrace EPUB and start to promote it, talk about it, stress the benefits of it, so that we can see it more widely adopted for the benefit ultimately of people, as I said, people with learning challenges and people without. But we know that if materials are purchased and produced in EPUB, the kids and the students who have these learning differences will not be left behind in their learning. So that is one of the main reasons why we're promoting it, and what better time to promote it so heavily and to make a big case for it than now, when many students across the country are learning at home, whether their district is doing completely remote learning or a hybrid, or maybe they're in person, but they may have to shut down at some point and they'll be back home. So the flexibility of this format, the many great features that it offers just lend itself really well to this environment. So it just seemed like the perfect time for this flexible format to work, that works for a range of learners in a variety of environments, to really come to the forefront.
And Christine, I just wanted to describe the image on the screen. This is from a news story that I came across recently, and it shows two young learners who are learning outside of a fast food restaurant because they're using the free Wi-Fi that's being provided. And a couple of the workers at the restaurant came out to see if they needed help. And so they discovered that that's what they were doing. They were accessing, the free Wi-Fi so that they could continue to read and learn using their devices that they have available. So in that environment, the lighting may not be great. And so being able to turn on the high contrast, or the screen may be really small, so being able to turn on or increase the text size might be really helpful. So that's part of as Christine mentioned, this is an interesting time to be learning and to be trying to access your learning. And we don't know where learners are going to be. So providing those flexible options is really important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. Great point. Okay, so now we're going to talk about where you can find high quality EPUBs. And this is a bit of a chicken and egg scenario in that there are definitely some sources that we're going to talk about of high quality EPUBs. We will see more that are geared toward post-secondary at this point. But the more demand that you all and your organizations make on content creators, the more of these we'll see. So right now, there aren't as many sources as we would like to see, not nearly as many. But the more that people start asking for it and expecting it from publishers and content creators, the more they'll step up and actually produce it. So this is somebody's got to start the process here, and we think it should start with those who are working closely with students who really need these features. And in the process, you can convince those in your organizations that from a market standpoint, from a cost saving standpoint, this makes a lot of sense. Investing in one type of format that works for all of your learners, rather than having to invest in one format for one group of your learners and then retrofit those materials, spending a lot of money oftentimes, and a lot of time and a lot of energy to retrofit them to get them to work for kids with different challenges. We would present to you that this one format might be sufficient in most cases to meet the needs of all of your learners. So we'll hit on a couple of sources here. Next, okay, great, thanks. So as Luis mentioned at the outset, a couple of commercial sources of books are Apple's bookstore, and so he showed a book that I'm assuming he got from Apple's bookstore that he was reading on the books with the Books app on his iPad. And he could have the same experience with a Books app on his Mac, or a similar experience. And then Google Play books, those are basically whenever you get a book from Google Play for any kind of reader on an Android device, you're more than likely getting an EPUB. And again, maybe just not even knowing it. A couple of providers of EPUB textbooks are Vital Source, which is actually has worked very closely with Benetech to produce a collection of materials that are all certified under our Global Certified Accessible initiative, and that offer, guaranteed offer an excellent reading experience for students, both with and without learning differences. And then Red Shelf is another similar source of EPUB textbooks. And then, actually, you're going to talk about this, right, Luis?
Yes, so one of your tasks that we have created for you, I don't want to call it homework. I want to call it more something for you to try out so that if you're new to EPUB, you can get started exploring some of the features. There's a website called Standard eBooks. It's at standardebooks.org, and Leslie has shared the link in the chat. So you can check that out. And what they've done is they've taken these public domain books. So public domain means that copyright no longer applies. And these books have been available through Project Gutenberg, where they're available for anyone to download. But they're not always the best looking books, because typically they're just text, just the text of the book. So what Standard eBooks has done is gone in and added some styling to those books so that they look really nice when you open them on the screen using your favorite EPUB reader. They support a number of formats that you can download these public domain books in. But for this purpose, we encourage you to check out one of their EPUB titles to check out. And that way you can start exploring a number of the reading apps that we're going to share with you later on in this webinar.
Great. So then I'd like to talk a little bit about Bookshare as a source of EPUBs for those students who qualify for Bookshare, which is basically students who have some kind of a barrier to reading or processing printed text because of something like dyslexia or a visual impairment or a physical disability, some condition that limits their ability to read or process printed text in the way someone would who didn't have any of those conditions. So that's at bookshare.org. And Bookshare members all have the opportunity to open books in Bookshare web reader using a button that they'll see called Read Now. So this is the end users of Bookshare. If you're a teacher on an organizational account, you're not going to see that Read Now button next to the books unless the book happens to be one of the freely available titles. We have about 10,000 of those in Bookshare, books that are, as Luis mentioned, no longer under copyright, or they've been made available more broadly and not restricted by copyright limitations. And so those titles for the sponsors on an organizational account, the teachers on an organizational account, will have the Read Now button. But for most of the titles in the collection, the Read Now button will only be available to the qualified member, so the student or the adult who themselves has a reading barrier and is a member of Bookshare. So when the student who's been assigned a book or uses their individual membership to locate a book, they find a book that they like, they can select that Read Now button, and it opens up in Bookshare web reader, which is a free browser-based reading tool that allows them to read, very quickly and easily. And actually, it's what it's doing is it's taking all of Bookshare books they start out in the DAISY format. That's Digital Accessible Information System is what DAISY stands for. And that's a fairly versatile format. And then what we do on the back end on the fly is we convert that book to an EPUB. And that allows it to open up in the web-based reading tool that we've created based on open source technology. And that allows readers to hear it read out loud and see the highlighting on the screen. And I have an asterisk here. I do want to make sure to mention that the text-to-speech and word highlighting features of Bookshare web reader are only available when you open a book, when you use that Read Now button logged into either Chrome or Safari or the latest Edge browser, the newest Edge browser also has this functionality. So if you're in any of those browsers and you're an end user of Bookshare and you find a book that you want to open and you select Read Now, it will open up in the browser. It will provide text-to-speech and word highlighting, very similar to the experience that Louise showed earlier on the iPad. Now, if a student uses a screen reader already, they can use any browser and just use their screen reader to read the book rather than the built-in text-to-speech engine in Bookshare Web Reader. And I will say that, as I mentioned earlier, Bookshare has 10,000 freely available titles. I'll put in the chat here as soon as I get done with this slide, I'll put a reference to a page where we'll point you to some great lists of those books. So this would be another way that you can try out EPUB. You can access some of Bookshare's freely available titles and use that Read Now button to be able to open them up in Bookshare Web Reader and enjoy that experience. Although I will say there are other tools that offer more functionality for customization and just that might make a little bit more pleasurable reading experience than Bookshare Web Reader. We offer that as a sort of a basic reading experience for our members, but we're going to talk about some other tools that offer more functionality, some of which are also free. But you could certainly use the Read Now button. The other option all members have, and you would have with any freely available title in Bookshare, is you can actually download it as an EPUB and then open it with a compatible reading tool, and we'll talk about what those are. So you'll see on the screen when a student or a member is logged into Bookshare and they have a book that they want to read, they have a choice of either selecting the Read Now button, or there's a drop down where they can select a format in which to download the document, the title. Which includes EPUB and also includes Word. Somebody asked a question earlier about the difference between Word and EPUB in Bookshare, and it really depends on the end user experience. I'll tell you quickly some pros and cons, since that did come up in the questions. So both of them offer navigation, the customization options. So Word has to be, to really get the most out of the Word file, you would want to open it in something like Immersive Reader, which is a function that's part of the latest versions of Microsoft Word. And if your desktop version of Word doesn't have Immersive Reader, the online version of Word does. And anybody can access the online version of Word. And you can then just search for Immersive Reader and it opens it up and it provides a really nice interactive reading experience. One of the downsides of downloading a book in Word is if it's a substantial length, the title is of substantial length, it's going to actually download as multiple Word files. So it's a little harder then to work with, it'll be maybe 6 different Word documents broken up by chapters, chapters 1 through 5, and then 6 through 10 or whatever will be in a separate document. So that's one of the disadvantages. But it just depends on how the person's going to read. Word is a great option if an individual who's reading a book doesn't have a tool that reads EPUB. Word is an excellent option. It's also a great offline option. So an easy way to read books if you can do it without, if you have Immersive Reader in your desktop version of Word, or even if you don't, even without Immersive Reader, there is another function in Word where you can select text and right click and have it just speak it out loud. At least it won't highlight the words, but it will speak it out loud. And so pretty much every version of Word these days should have that capability. So there's an offline option there for reading with Word. And EPUB, as Louise mentioned, is more like a website, all sort of packaged into one, and it's going to be more self-inclusive and self-sufficient in and of itself, but it does require a tool that reads EPUB. So I think it just depends on the end user and how they're going to be reading. But this is another way that you'll be able to experiment with downloading and opening EPUBs, and we'll point you to where you can do that.
And some of you asked about different reading platforms, different reading apps. So this is just a partial list of free EPUB readers. These are available to anyone. So if you're on Windows, there's a reader called Thorium, Thorium, Thorium Reader. It's actually available for Mac and Linux as well, but the Windows version is the easiest to install because it's available to the Microsoft Store. Microsoft has created a reading room section of their Microsoft Store where you can download a number of reading apps, and you're going to find Thorium as one of the options there. So it's built around open source technology, and the latest version of Thorium now supports text-to-speech. So before you could, perform a lot of the customizations in terms of the appearance, but you didn't have the text-to-speech built in. And now in the latest version, that's available. So that is something to try out if you are, you want to read EPUB titles on the Windows system. I've already shown you Apple Books. So that's the default reading app on Apple devices, including iPhone, iPad, and the Mac. That's a really easy way to open EPUB titles and then be able to customize them. On mobile devices, if you need to open an EPUB in Android, Dolphin Easy Reader is a free app. You can try it out for free on Android and iOS devices like the iPad and the iPhone. It is not free on Windows. There is a cost to it, but that's where you could choose Thorium Reader for your Windows reading, and then maybe choose Dolphin Easy Reader for when you're on a mobile device. And then if you're on a Chromebook, there is a tool called the Read and Write PDF Reader. And it's actually not named correctly because it can actually also open EPUB. So it's not just a PDF reader. It allows you to open EPUB as well. And we have a note here. One tool that does not support EPUB is the Kindle e-readers. So these are the physical Kindle e-readers. Amazon actually uses its own proprietary format, and so EPUB is not supported on there. But as you can see, there's a vast selection of different free tools that you can try out, whether you're on the desktop or on a mobile device. These are all some of the free options, and I'm sure there's more out there. So let's just take a break here and see, have any of you tried any of these? And what's been your experience? And then let's take a couple of questions too. See if we can answer a few of these, Christine.
Yeah, sure. So one thing I wanted to mention, I forgot to mention earlier, if a student is using an iPad, for example, and they launch a browser such as Safari or Chrome, and they go to bookshare.org and they're a Bookshare member and they download the book in EPUB onto their iPad, during the download process, they'll actually get the opportunity, they'll be prompted to, they'll be asked, would you like to open this in? And it will give you a list of compatible apps on the iPad. So that's a nice a nice experience, pretty smooth experience. So on an iPad, downloading the Bookshare book in EPUB format from either, from a browser, Chrome or Safari. And then during the download process, you're prompted to open in a particular on the iPad. So there was a question about using Read and Write along with the Read Now, the Bookshare web reader, and that is absolutely true. And that's a very nice reading experience. We highly recommend that. Read and Write is, I'm not sure if Luis mentioned it, but it is free for teachers, I believe, and there's a free trial for everyone. And even after the free trial ends, the main reading feature is still available. I'm going to post in the chat a link to a video that we have on our site that shows how to use Read and Write with Bookshare web reader. It's basically a toolbar that lays over on top of Bookshare web reader and adds a lot of nice functionality and better voices, better color contrast, more customization options. So great point. And I'll grab that video and put it in the chat. Was there another question that I can answer?
There was one here around Dolphin on Mac. computers. As far as I know, I've only used it on Windows and then the mobile devices, but there are options. You know, we mentioned Books works in a very similar way, whether you're on your iPad or you switch to the Mac. And then you have text-to-speech that's built into both systems, and it has really high quality voice. It's the same voice that the screen reader uses, but you can use it for the read out loud as well. I use the Alex voice because it's really advanced and it does a really nice job. So I use Books primarily on the Mac. Nicole, do you have any other suggestions for on the Mac?
No, actually, I was just trying to think. I actually, off the top of my head, but I'll do some quick research to see if I can come back to that.
The other option I would recommend, since Nicole mentioned, or why do I keep calling you Nicole today, Christine? I don't know why. It must be on my mind for some reason. So Christine, let's emphasize that. So one of the things you can do, she mentioned the Word. So if you were to open, download the title as Word and then use the immersive reader, that's also an option if you don't have access to a reading app on the Mac. But again, for most students, the built-in Books app is really easy to use, and you can take advantage of all those customizations and also use the read out loud. All right, so let's go ahead and continue on. We just wanted to take a break there and give you a chance to take a breather and stretch a little bit, but we'll continue on, and then we'll come back at the end and answer a few more of your excellent questions. So again, this is just a partial list. We've really tried to start with just these free apps, but know that there are also commercial options, and generally the commercial options will have even more customization that's possible. And then in some cases, you can also buy additional voices that are even of higher quality in terms of how they process the text. But this gives you, the list that's on the slides, gives you a nice foundation regardless of which platform you're using. So the next thing we want to do is just talk about content creators and how EPUB is beneficial there. And as we said, a lot of content creators are moving to using EPUB as their primary delivery format because it does create some time and cost savings. Being able to start digital and go all the way through with a digital workflow that results in a format that is also accessible. And I apologize for my dog. It's getting to be the time when his mom comes home, so you may hear him in the background. So in terms of content creation, one of the benefits here is that you know, there's lots of tools out there that support exporting to EPUB. And just like with being able to read EPUB, I bet you're familiar with a lot of these tools and you didn't probably know that they could export to EPUB. So for instance, Google Docs has a download as EPUB option. In Apple's Pages, you can now open a a template that allows you to create an EPUB title very easily. And then, hold on one second, everyone. I'll be right back. I'm going to grab my dog so he calms down. Christine, do you want to take over for just a few seconds here?
Sure. So as Luis was saying, a lot of these tools already have the ability to export to EPUB. And you might ask, well, why would you do that? And again, you know, it depends on the end user and the tool that they're going to use and the reading experience that they want to have. For some, reading an EPUB might actually be more beneficial than reading a Google Doc, for example, or even a Microsoft Word document. Again, maybe they want to read with, Dolphin Easy Reader, or actually we forgot to mention Voice Dream Reader. That's an app that is available on both Android and iOS. And Voice Dream Reader allows you to import, other content, a variety of content. I believe it also connects with Google Drive. So it might be that an EPUB is going to provide a better experience because they're using Voice Dream Reader or a similar reading tool. And again, getting all that functionality in one one sort of one file is really a very worthwhile experience.
And I'm back. So as I was saying, I don't know what the last part of that was, Christine, but all of these applications that we're familiar with, and a lot of them we use for our day-to-day word processing, can export to EPUB. And one of them is Microsoft Word, which again, many of you are using. And with a free plugin that we'll mention in just a second, you can make it so that Microsoft Word can export to EPUB. So here's a simple workflow for creating EPUB documents from Microsoft Word with accessibility in mind. So the first thing you want to do is you want to start with an accessible file in Microsoft Word. And you would do that by following a number of best practices. And we have lots of resources on the AIM Center website so that you can start incorporating accessibility into your word processing or your content creation workflow right from the start in the source file that you're working in Microsoft Word. And then Microsoft Word has a really nice, robust accessibility checker. And it's always a good idea before you do an export to use that checker and check your work. Just like you do a spell check, you can run that accessibility checker just to make sure you haven't missed anything to check your work. And then there is a free plugin from the DAISY Consortium, and it's called Word to EPUB. And so the name is pretty self-explanatory. It takes a Microsoft Word file, and then it allows you, with a few clicks of the mouse, to export to EPUB. And again, if you've started with an accessible source file, then a lot of that accessibility is going to transfer over to that final EPUB file or title that you can then share. So again, this webinar is just the first part of a 3-part series. And in part 3 on November the 10th, then we're going to explore Word to EPUB in more detail. We're going to show you this workflow and how it works to create an accessible EPUB file starting in Microsoft Word. And as I mentioned, there are lots of resources from both Benetech and the AIM Center that can help you continue your learning about this really flexible format that can support a variety of different learners in lots of different environments. And so we've created a page on the AIM Center website, Getting Started with EPUB, and it provides a lot of background information for you to share with others. You can, of course, yourself review it to make sure that you have a good understanding of EPUB, but also share it with others so that, again, as Christine has mentioned a number of times, we want to get everyone on board with this format to make sure that we're increasing the demand for the format within the marketplace in education. So we have an activity for you to put what you've learned today into action. And so this is something that you can try out. I'm going to sort of adjust the instructions a little bit because Christine gave me a really nice idea. Obviously, you can try out standard ebooks. That's available for free. Those are public domain titles. You can go to standard ebooks, download a free title, and then try to open it with any of the tools that we mentioned during this webinar. So you can go back to the slide where we had that list of different tools that are free and that are available on a range of different platforms. Or, like Christine said, there are a number of free titles available on Bookshare as well, that you don't have to be an eligible member to download those. So you have an option there. We just want you to find a source of EPUB and then try that out with a number of different reading tools so that you can see what the format provides. And I would encourage you, go out with your device if you're on a mobile device, because this is how I benefit from EPUB in a big way. I can go to the beach, I can go to the pool, and I can open up a book on my mobile device and I can adjust the text size. I can turn on that high contrast background. And so now I'm able to read in a variety of different environments. So I encourage you to check that out. And Christine just shared the link to the freely available books on Bookshare. And we'll add that to the handout as well. So we'll update the handout. So you have a choice. of a couple of different sources of EPUB that you can use to try out different features and different reading systems.
And Luis, there was a question that came in that I thought we could discuss for a minute, and it's a really good one. So are these features available, speaking about the features that you were demonstrating in the EPUB, the book that was reading on the iPad, are they available on all e-reader apps and all EPUBs, or does it vary? And I think we should, we can talk about that a little bit, because we know that not all e-readers are created equal and not all EPUBs are created equal, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'll start with the e-reader question. It really depends on the application. So some of them are a little bit simpler. I showed you Apple Books, right? And you just have a few customization options in there. But then, as Christine mentioned, there are apps like the free Dolphin Easy Reader or the commercial voice stream reader. These are apps that have even more options. So for instance, we have options for the margins that could help somebody who has limited peripheral vision, which is the case for me. I need those margins brought in so that I can see more of the book in the center of the screen. Or you can customize the line spacing. You can do things like bring in a mask so that you're not seeing the entire page, but just a few lines of text. And that can be really helpful for focusing attention while reading and removing some distractions, or it can be really helpful for being able to follow along as you're listening to the book with a read aloud. So it really depends on the reading application, and they get updated all the time with new features as they become available in the operating system as well. And then the last thing that I would mention on the reading apps is that some of them, you get the app and then they have additional things you can buy. So for instance, you can buy more high quality voices that are available commercially and so on. So you can customize that app even further. So for instance, you can add a children's voice so that they're not listening to an adult that has been modified, but a lot of the reading apps now support children's voices as well, so that a child is actually listening to a voice that was created from people their own age. So lots of options out there. And then Christine, do you want to address the format question or?
Yeah, so quickly though, there was a question before we get too far away from readers in the chat about when someone went to standard ebooks and downloaded an EPUB, and it remember how it has that choice between you can choose either advanced EPUB or I forget what the term is.
Compatible EPUB.
Compatible, right? And it says the advanced EPUB doesn't work on all e-readers. So clearly, that's not the best choice at this point to download the more standard ebook,
Yep.
and hopefully that'll be useful.
Yeah, and EPUB is an evolving standard, so that's another nice thing about it, is that it can adapt over time. There's support for math, for instance, is always improving. Support for different types of content like multimedia and so on. So some apps may support that, but for this activity, focus on the compatible EPUB. That's going to be supported more broadly across all of these different apps.
Right, and as far as the format itself, as if the document was originally set up with full navigation and basically structured in the right way, it should be an accessible EPUB, but there are a lot of differences there. So you may find even from the standard ebook site that some of them don't offer some of the same functionality that others do. I'm not as familiar with that site, so I don't know how carefully they've applied those standards in terms of navigability and structure. But that's part of the message that we're trying to get out, is that if you, like, for example, if you're creating something and you're converting it to EPUB, that's why Luis talked about, using your accessibility checker first before you convert to EPUB, so that you're sure that the file is structured and built in a way that it's going to maintain that structure when it converts to an EPUB. So those are important things to check. I also wanted to just quickly provide some more information about Benetech's work around what we call born accessible. So teaching content creators, specifically publishers and people involved in the publishing workflow, to build their content in a way that's accessible from the beginning. And we have a certification program called Global Certified Accessible. We have a growing number of publishers who are submitting their content to Bookshare, or sorry, to Benetech to certify. And as that becomes more common, you'll be able to, have a very guaranteed way of choosing accessible EPUBs just by selecting materials that have been certified by Benetech. So put that here. And then let's see, Luis, there was another question that came in the Q&A. Oh yeah, can you convert a PDF to an EPUB? And what's interesting is I know that you can do it the other way around. You can convert an EPUB to a PDF. We had at the Bookshare customer support team, we had someone call in who was adamant that they really needed their book in a PDF, which of course we generally are not big fans of PDF because they don't always offer the accessibility. But this individual, really wanted it that way. So we were discussing internally different ways to get to PDF format, which we don't actually offer in Bookshare. And one of them certainly is you can convert an EPUB to a PDF, but it's a little cumbersome because you have to look for a tool to do it.
Right.
You can convert Word to PDF a lot more easily, but I don't know about the conversion the other way around. And I would.
So they want to go from PDF to EPUB?
Yes, that's correct.
So one thing you could do is there are lots of applications that allow you to take a PDF and convert it to, perform what's called OCR, or optical character recognition, so that you get the text of the PDF, and then you can basically use Word. You can copy and paste into Word. You may need to do a little bit of work. So again, as Christine mentioned, it can be a little bit cumbersome. And then that PDF, you can then use the Word to EPUB plugin to get it from Word out to EPUB. So I'm sure there's a better way, but I've been on a couple of listservs where that's come up, and then that's something that's been done. You can take an inaccessible PDF, and again, if you can get it into a text format and then perform some markup, because you'll probably have to indicate where the headings are. Then you should be able to export it to EPUB from Word using the Word to EPUB plugin. But what we're talking about right now is what we call a retrofit. So what we want to do ideally, Christine mentioned the Certified Accessible Initiative, and I mentioned how we want to start with an accessible file in Word and then export that to EPUB. And that's really a more proactive approach, where we're starting with accessibility in mind from the start, and then creating a file that will have accessibility in it throughout our workflow, as opposed to performing all these conversions, because those conversions are costly in terms of time and money. We know that time is money, right? So while we can do it, it is also, a big investment of time. So the more we can do to be proactive and start with an accessible format to begin with, the better.
Absolutely. And again, as we've said a couple of times, we just want to stress that the only way this happens is if everybody starts expecting it and demanding it and asking for EPUB. We will see what we have seen in post-secondary, where publishers finally recognize the business case, the value from an economic standpoint for them in producing materials in a format that has broad appeal and broad usability. And so again, the more we push it, the more we ask for it, the more we expect it, the more their publishers will come around. So
absolutely.
Yeah. You guys, all of you who are purchasing materials have that power. So.
Yeah, so our message is EPUB, ask for it by name. I don't know, I couldn't come up with anything catchier than that. But we've reached the end of our hour together, so I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. On the screen and also in the chat, we're going to share our contact information. We may not have gotten to all of your questions this afternoon, but you can always get in touch with Christine or myself. Our contact information is available through the slides. So feel free to reach out and let us know if you have any questions. I want to thank Christine and Benetech for joining us for this webinar. Really appreciate your expertise.
Thank you, Luis.
And Leslie O'Callahan, who's been in the chat. She's been sharing lots of great resources and links for us. And then also Beth from ACS Captioning for providing the captions for this webinar. So a reminder that this has been recorded, and the recording and all the other resources are available on the AIM Center website on the same page where you registered for the webinar. And then lastly, Leslie's going to share a link in the chat. We really appreciate your feedback. Please just take a second to fill out our post-webinar survey. That really helps us improve these webinars going forward. So thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, and we hope to see you on part 2 and 3 of this webinar series. And someone just asked when the next webinar is. Next week, next Tuesday, same time, 2 p.m. Eastern.
And I just put a little, if you go to the AIM website's events page, it lists all of our upcoming events.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Leslie.
And we'll definitely add to the handout for this webinar all of the links that we've shared in the chat if they weren't already in there. So just so that you all know.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Luis.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, Leslie. Thank you, Beth. Bye.